So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on what time you want to watch this video. So I think I've covered all three of those for you. Today we're going to be going through fire departments, OH&S legislation, and the OH&S guide for firefighting and what it actually consists of and where it works with the OH&S legislation. This is for BES 410, Practicum 2, Cohort Group B, Facilitator Paul Fulbrook, and myself, Dave Laurin. So I've been the fire chief with Red Deer County Protective Services. I've been with Red Deer County for 12 years. I held the position of district fire chief for the initial 7 years and then moved up to fire chief for the county. My history comes from, I started off as a volunteer. Then I moved from different areas, went to different stations. I was then with Firemaster as senior course developer and instructor in the industrial world. Worked on course development for a lot of industrial places and training officer at different departments. I also hold, I'm an EMT, or in Ontario they're called EMCAs, from 1992, and that's basically when I got my start in emergency services. So these are just some questions for you to ponder. Think about them for a minute and see what your thought process is. So our fire department's exempt from OH&S legislation. Do we have to follow every section as written in the OH&S legislation? What is considered a work site for fire departments? What are responsibilities for management? And in our world, management would be incident command, supervisors, which they would be our officers, and workers, which would be our firefighters. What is the OH&S guide for firefighting? How does it work with OH&S legislation? And does the OH&S legislation have to be followed when we're dealing with fire inspections and or fire investigations? So those are just some thoughts to actually ponder and get your mind thinking in the way of OH&S. The objectives for the course that we're going to be looking at is review and breakdown of the parts of the OH&S legislation, areas pertaining to firefighter and rescue, important definitions, because throughout the OH&S Blue Book there are multiple definitions in multiple areas. Introduction of the OH&S Guide for Firefighting. Here on forth, we'll just call it the guide. And parts and sections of the OH&S Guide for Firefighting covered in the OH&S legislation and the inner working relationship between the two documents. As per our actual course, one of the things we had to come up with was presentation questions or thoughts that you would be able to answer after the end of the presentation. So these questions are: is there a difference between an emergency scene and a fire investigation scene as per OH&S? What part and section of the OH&S code gives us leniency on not having to use fall protection while we are climbing, working from a ladder, or performing roof operations? Even as a firefighter, do we have to follow the clean-shaven aspect for the wearing of respiratory protection? If so, in what part or section is this actually covered in the OH&S code? And does performing a fire investigation by yourself constitute working alone? Can a fire investigator working alone don SCBA for the purpose of the investigation? The reason why I bring that one forward is years ago I taught a course on safety in the investigations, and I found out there are a lot of full-time departments that run an investigation branch that the investigators are out on a scene by themselves after the crews leave. So that is where this question actually stemmed from. So just curious, how did you actually answer the points to ponder, the questions to ponder? So one, no, we are not exempt. We have to follow the blue book as well as anyone else. We do have to follow, however, we do have some minor exemptions in the book that is specific for fire personnel. For fire departments, the work sites that we actually have to deal with is the incident scene, the station where our day-to-day ops occur, and our apparatus. So when we view the OH&S code, we actually have 3 work sites that we're looking at. For question number 4 about whose responsibility as per incident command officer firefighters, responsibility is across the board for all involved. Firefighters or the workers have obligations, supervisors have obligations, IC has obligations, and the employer has obligations as well. What is the OH&S guide? Well, at this point, it's a minimum standards to which a fire service must comply under OH&S legislation. It's also a bulletin to assist with interpretation of the OH&S legislation and how we have to follow it. And for the last question, yes. So, Objective A, review and breakdown of the parts of the OH&S legislation. So I have obtained all my information from said blue book, the same picture, the same book that's in there, with all my tabs all the way through it, top and side. I haven't got to the bottom yet, that'll come. The blue book is the Occupational Health and Safety. It contains within it the Act, regulations, and code, and there's more sections in it that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And this is the version that had amendments in force as of June 1st, 2018. That is the last update of this document. So parts of the legislation. Within the blue book itself, we have the Occupational Health and Safety Act, that is the first section. From there, we have the Occupational Health and Safety Regulation. We then have the Farming and Ranching Exemption Regulation. Then we have the Administrative Penalty, which is under Administrative Penalty Regulation. And then last but not least, we have the Occupational Health and Safety Code. And also within the code, there is schedules, tables, and an index as well. So we'll look at the Occupational Health and Safety Act. So that's the first one. That is the document legislation that gives this power, and what does it actually entail. So it actually has 13 parts within it. It talks about obligations. So obligations of the employer, obligations of supervisors, obligations of workers, gets into obligations of prime contractors, obligations and relationships between an employer and a prime contractor. It goes through all that parts. Then from there it gets into committees, what the committees are on the development and work on this book. It defines and gets into what dangerous work is and part of the right to refuse dangerous work. One thing we're still waiting for is years ago they used to have in the code an actual section about firefighters, because our job is inherently dangerous, dealing with dangerous work sites. We had a little bit different of the ruling of the right to refusal for dangerous work. It's not been produced in the code yet. What the actual health and safety program is that municipalities, workplaces actually have to develop. Also deals with the minister and staff. Compliance and enforcement of the code is all covered within this section of the Act. It gives the information on review, appeal processes, offensives, and penalties, and how you have to deal with those. It gives information on the information collection, regulations, and administration of the Act, and it deals with any provisions, amendments, or repeals that will come to this document. The Occupational Health and Safety Regulation. So the regulation has 5 parts. It has what they call the general part, and that deals with hazardous occupations, work sites. Then it gets into blasting, blasting permits, and mining, which none of us usually in the fire world will deal with that unless you are a fire brigade on a mining site. Then it gets into the records, and this is the retention of records for different areas and fees. And it also gets into any of the extra programs, approvals, and what are designated organizations under the regulation. The next section, which is, I'm not a farmer, but if we had this, it is basically an exemption regulation. So it more or less states, if you're running a true farm, you are exempt from the OH&S code. That's it in a nutshell. This section's only 3 pages. Administrative penalties, so occupational, under the Occupational Health and Safety Act regulation. So this is the area that it gives a definition of what this is. It talks about how you have to, how a notice of penalty is going to come about to an organization or a business. What is the amount of penalty, how payment has to occur, and there's even different tables in here on ticketable offenses. So I just listed 2 of them that we could have that could be very relative to the fire department at any given time. And the first one is actually on page 2, part 1, general. And this penalty is employer failed to ensure worker use or wore required equipment. So if you have an individual injured on your scene, investigation was occurred, and it was found that that individual did not wear their safety glasses when they're supposed to, there could be the chance of the employer getting issued a $500 fine and the supervisor being issued a $500 fine. The second one that I chose to look at here, again, we have to have this in all of our departments, but WHMIS, Workplace Hazardous Materials Information System, and that includes the area where a binder is kept for all the MSDSs. And this is an example. The employer failed to ensure required MSDS was readily available at the work site. So if you're missing MSDS sheets on the products that you utilize within your halls, you could be looking at, as the employer, a $500 fine. So just a couple simple things that we could easily be faced with. The Occupational Health and Safety Code. This is more or less the meat and potatoes of the entire book, of the entire OH&S legislation. It is broken into 41 different parts. Majority of the rules that we have to follow comes from this area, comes from the parts and sections. Schedules and indexes are also included in this. And of the 34 areas covered by the Guide for Firefighting, 32 are referenced from the code, which is this section, and 2 are actually referenced from the first section, the Act. Objective B, areas pertaining to fire departments, firefighting, and rescue. So under the OH&S Act, that's the first area, all parts are in reference to fire departments and firefighting. If we look at the OH&S regulation, it's part 1 that we fall under for the departments, and part 5, section 45. And 45 comes under the realm of training. Under the administrative penalty regulation, we have to follow all parts of it. Under the OH&S code itself, we have to follow part 2 to 8, part 9, 138 of part 9, and we'll get into what that one actually is. That is one of the only true exemptions that we have in the entire OH&S code. Part 10, part 11, part 12, then part 13 to 30 inclusive, part 32 to 35 inclusive, and part 41. Not every section of every part, though, is required to be followed, depending on what the tasks are that we are actually doing. Objective C, important definitions. So with the definitions, it's actually broke down in multiple parts of the code. In the Act, one of the first definitions that we need to look at is competent. Because competent is a term that's used throughout the Act and throughout the regulation and throughout the code, especially when it comes to supervision and training. Competent in relation to a person means adequately qualified, suitably trained, and with sufficient experience to safely perform work without supervision or with only a minimum degree of supervision. So that is what they're referencing as a competent person. Harassment's another one. Harassment with this day and age becomes a huge aspect, not only in the fire service, not only in EMS, not in law enforcement, but anywhere that this book pertains, harassment can be a large scope now. Harassment means any single incident or repeated incidents. And it is objectable or unwelcome conduct, comment, bullying, or action by a person that the person knows or ought reasonably to know will or would cause offense or humiliation to a worker or adversely affects the worker's health and safety, and includes conduct, comment, bullying, or action because of race, religious beliefs, color, physical disability, mental disability, age, ancestry, place of origin, marital status, source of income, family status, gender, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation, and sexual solicitation or advance. So, one of the things an employer has the obligation to do is to operate in a harassment-free environment. Workers have that right to be employed at a harassment-free environment. So we have to ensure that now, if we have bullying or harassment or anything within the fire scene, within the fire station, within the workplace or work site, that is actually under OH&S that it's covered. It's not just labor standards anymore, OH&S has a part in this as well. I'm not going to go through and read every definition. Health and safety is defined. Manufacturer specifications, we'll talk about that, where that comes into play. Supervisor, in our words, officer. Train, worker, work site, and under the work site definition is where we actually have for us 3 different work sites. Under the OH&S regulation, they have a definition there for direct supervision. And under the OH&S code, direct supervision is also referenced there as a definition, and the 2 definitions are pretty close to identical. Other things in the code, what a carabiner actually is, and it even mentions about a double locking action. So the old single action carabiners cannot be used for anything. Not for our world, for rescue, for life safety, for rope access. Excess noise, industrial rope access, life jacket versus a personal flotation device, what the differences are. Non-industrial rope access work and occupational rope access work. Non-industrial rope access work is more in the climbing realms, rock climbing, it's recreational. Occupation is where we get into rescue activities. Objective D, Introduction of OH&S Guide for Firefighting. So the OH&S Guide for Firefighting, this one came out in March of 2019. With the old OH&S code, we had what we called the same thing, OH&S Guide for Firefighting, and it was out in March of 2007. So since the new code came out, they redid this document. And this is an excerpt right from the opening paragraph of the document. This bullet describes the minimum standards to which a fire service must comply under occupational health and safety legislation. And that is from the Occupational Health and Safety OH&S Guide for Firefighting, FEX 003, March 2019, produced from the government of Alberta. So they are the ones who wrote this, and this is what the minimum standards are that we have to follow. It highlights specific sections that can apply to firefighting. The sections, though, that it highlights are just summaries of the sections. It doesn't go through it word by word. You need to use this document with this document. The two have to go hand in hand together. Does talk a little bit on the Act, Regulation, and Code, but again, it's an information document. It does not state, in this you can do this. This is an information bulletin only. It does not replace or act as a substitute to the Blue Handbook. The additional requirements are actually found in the Act, the regulations, and/or the Code. It assists with clarification to a point. However, with a lot of government documents, it also muddies the water even more than it gives clarification to it. The Act, the regulation, and the Code is the legislation and is the law. So, Objective E, parts and sections covered in the guide. So as I said, you have to utilize the guide and utilize the handbook together. The section under training. So I have followed this verbatim, where the sections are, and just to give brief synopsis of what the sections actually are. So the first one, training. The training references back to the Act, the regulation, and the Code. Section 3(2) of the Act, Section 15 of the regulation, and throughout the Code. Provided before the firefighter is allowed. So there's different things we have to follow. Training has to be provided before a firefighter is allowed to do things. The training has to be provided by a competent persons. Back to the definitions. The training has to address the OH&S hazards and also addresses the safe operation of the equipment and addresses procedures that are in place to actually utilize the equipment. Next one, hazard assessment, elimination, and control, part 2. Where it referenced back to is part 2 of the OH&S code. The employer to assess a work site for hazards, eliminate or control, and communicate. So it gets more into the talking about safety tailgate meetings, hazard identifications. In our world, it's a little hard for us to do that. So we pull up onto a scene, we have a rocking house fire, and we're not going to gather everybody and take a 15-minute safety briefing at the tailgate and write down everything and then go to work, because if we do that, we're probably not going to have jobs for too long. However, we do a lot of our hazard assessments within our SOGs that we already know the majority of hazards at a structure fire, or a motor vehicle collision, or a lift assist, or whatever the call may be. A lot of that's covered. Yes, if we have different hazards or different things that are noticeably showing within a scene, that has to be announced and communicated to all. Our assessments are performed and ongoing, hopefully by an incident safety officer that's on the scene. Guidelines and policies developed should include, as per NFPA standards, A to G. So there's a section here where it talks about identification of the standard firefighting functions, minimum number of firefighters, so that's your critical tasking, specific worker safety rules, guideline or policy on minimum amount of training, detailed description of the incident, and a detailed description of the personnel accountability system that has to be in place. Specifications and certifications. This is an OH&S code part 3, section 12. It applies to all of our equipment and supplies. So what this is getting into is, if you buy a set of Paris-Tech struts, you need to use it what it is designed for. You need to use it as per the rated capacity. You are not allowed to make modifications to it. And if modifications are to be made, it has to be done with the approval of an engineer and an engineered stamp drawing. And it has to be operated as per the manufacturer's specifications of that piece of equipment. One of the things that used to happen for years on departments is departments would have a regular jackal. We would modify the base of the jackal to be able to use it at an angle on MVC for stabilization. We would place a steel tube over the top of it, and that would be our jackal strut. Okay? Were we using it what it was designed for? No, not a chance. Were we using the rated capacity? Not really, because we were using it different than what it was designed for. Were we modifying it? Oh yes. We modified it a lot to work for us. Did we go out and get an engineered stamp and have a drawing associated with it? No, somebody built it in their garage and brought it into the hall. Chemical hazards, biological hazards, harmful substances as part of the OH&S code, part 4. This addresses exposure. It also, in Schedule 1, Table 2, there are 53 pages of occupational exposure limits for different chemical substances. This is not only on dangerous goods response, it could be a gasoline fire. It could be a fluid cleanup of a gasoline product. Worker may be contaminated. This is all in section 23. And it also talks about the aspect of deconning our firefighters after a scene. This is the area that also gets into if firefighters have made entrance into an interior firefight, they come out, their gear is full of soot and dirt or whatever, that gear is now contaminated and has to be washed. That is where this all comes out of the OH&S code. Confined space. If you are a department that is providing rescue services for confined space, you must comply with all the requirements of Part 5. Talks about pre-entry. You have to develop and have a code of practice that everyone adheres to. You have to still do entry permits, and you have to maintain records on your confined spaces. Okay, or on your confined spaces, incidents or rescues. Cranes, hoists, lifting devices. If you're using something that has a rated load of 2,000 kgs or more, then you actually have to follow this section. Again, the lifting device, the competent workers, inspection and use, and maintenance lot. A lot of us are going, you know what, we don't have a crane, so why do I need to follow this? Well, if you look at some of the different aerial platforms that are out there now, some of them have rated anchor points within the bottom of the platform that they can actually do a lift of greater than 2,000 kg, depending on the manufacturer. So if you do get into those kind of works, then you need to follow part 6. Emergency preparedness and response. Emergency response plan for responding to an emergency. So it sounds kind of funny, we're the ones that are doing the emergency response, but it actually says here, we need an emergency response plan within the confines of the fire department that covers a response plan for our own operations. So if we have firefighters make an entry, they become trapped or disorientated, then this response plan covers how do we evacuate, how do we do a PAR, how do we set up for rescue, how do we rescue our own. That is what this is. So that's why I think of rapid intervention teams or rapid intervention crews. Entrances, walkways, stairways, and ladders. This is OH&S Code Part 8. It talks about that we need to have a secondary escape route. Reasonable practical steps are taken. And it does have a section on manufactured portable ladders and what standards they have to be made to. Fall protection, OH&S Code Part 9. This is the only part in the entire code where we have a specific exemption from the code. And it is actually section 138, and it reads, rescue personnel involved in training or in providing emergency rescue services may use equipment and practices other than those specified in this part. So usually it talks about any work done over 3 meters, you have to be in fall arrest with a lanyard or ladder clips, actually utilizing them. With this, we're still allowed to use our leg lock system. Or when we're up on the roof, we still have 3 points of contact utilizing a roof ladder and a pickaxe embedded into the other side. 139, 140 still have to be followed. Fire and explosion hazards, this is part 10. It actually states this section was never made to be intended to apply to burning buildings or exploding structures. Okay. Section 1621 prohibits entry of area greater than 20% LEL for a product in there. However, section 1622 allows competent, properly equipped to enter for an emergency response. So you could have in a structure fire greater than 20% LEL for carbon monoxide. Okay? But you can still make entry and deal with it. Most likely in this, the OELs that are listed in the table will be exceeded. First aid, OH&S Part 11, normal day-to-day ops and when dealing with an emergency. Records as per the sections that are listed. Schedule 2 talks about how big of a scene, how far away from the hospital, what do we have to have for personnel with training on that scene. This, though, you have to remember, deals with our people. This has nothing to do with the victims or the patients or the clients, whatever you want to call them. So responding to an MCI, we have 100 victims. This still deals with us and our personnel, not the victims. General safety requirements, part 12. It deals with lighting, securing of equipment and materials, It deals with signalers, so signalers would be somebody who's given signals to a crane operator. That's a signaler. It also has a full section on here on vehicle traffic control. So at our MVCs where we set up traffic management, there's a section here that we actually should be following. Noise exposure. Part 16. So first off, it talks about reasonably practical and what is reasonably practical. It gives an occupational exposure limit on Table 1, Schedule 3. It talks about the hearing protection and the kinds that can be used as per Table 2, Schedule 3. But it also gets into workplace noise exposure assessment, noise management program, and audiometric monitoring. If we have any of our tools or devices that are greater than the occupational exposure limits, we are actually supposed to have all of our tools then decibel readings monitored to see what they are. That goes into a workplace noise exposure assessment. Then we have to put in place a noise management program, and then it is up to us to have and pay for audiometric monitoring done with all of our employees. So all of our workers, what's supposed to happen is they go initially, and then they go once every 2 years to be that a monitoring program. Overhead power lines, OH&S code part 17. So the OH&S code part 17, we have to follow it all. It talks about the safe limits of approach as per the amount of energy going through the line. That's on Schedule 4, Table 1. It also talks about hazard assessment, SOGs in place, and training for all involved. More or less, a lot of it that we follow is the 7 meters. And that 7 meter rule is actually in there. Personal protective equipment, so this is part 18. Footwear section 233. We do have 2 spots in the personal protective equipment where we're actually allowed to go with NFPA standards. So here it talks about NFPA 1971 or CSA approval, the green triangle for steel toe boots. Head protection is again NFPA 1971 is mentioned. Also NFPA 1977 is mentioned for the wildland standard. Acceptable protection level for the hazards faced is another mention that it talks about. And what it's talking about in there, if you're doing a river rescue or a water rescue, your bunker gear is not an acceptable protection level anymore. You need to switch to something else. Respiratory protection is also part of Part 18. It is sections 244 to 255. Talks about our SCBA has to be NIOSH approved, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. If we're using BA or if we're using respiratory protection on any of our scenes for anything, we are supposed to have a fully developed code of practice that deals with selection, maintenance, and use of our SCBA. There is standards that have to be followed. If you have a breathing air compressor where we fill our bottles, it has to be air quality. And then section 250, subsection 1 and subsection 2 talks about fit test and facial seal. So 251, an employer must ensure that respiratory protective equipment that depends on effective facial seal for its safe use is correctly fit tested and tested in accordance with CSA standards. And 252, the employer must ensure that if a worker is or may be required to wear respiratory protective equipment and the effectiveness of the equipment depends on an effective facial seal, The worker is clean shaven where the facepiece of the equipment seals to the skin of the face. So for the arguments that used to be before that it was a person's right to have the ability to wear a beard, yes, they can wear a beard, they just can't be a firefighter on BA. Powered mobile equipment, part 19. This talks and deals with apparatus, vehicles, ATVs. Also talks about being competently trained in the use of them. Talks about inspections and talks about records. There's also a section here that is personal vehicle used for work. So in the case of paid on call or volunteers, responding from your place of residence or your place of work to the hall, that is not part of this. However, if you're the department, you're the member on the department who has a pickup, and the chief says to you, hey, can you bring your pickup out to the scene? I want you to load a bunch of hose in it to bring it back to the hall. You now fall under this area, personal vehicle used for work. Radiation exposure, OH&S code part 20, applies to all work sites, all industry. Rigging, which is part of OH&S part 21, this could deal with, in our world, winch operations. We don't do a lot of overhead rigging for crane lifts, but we do horizontal movement, and that's our winch operations. Safeguards, OH&S code part 22. If it has a guard, you must use it. So if your grinder came with a guard, you have to use it. If your chainsaw came with an anti-kick device, which is basically a guard, it has to be left on your chainsaw. If not, you have to have specific operational procedures in place why that guard has been removed, for what purposes, and how you ensure the safety of the operation of the tool. Scaffolds, temporary work platforms. If encountered, we must follow part 23. So we get called out to assist at a scaffold collapse or an injured worker on a scaffold in an industrial or commercial construction site. We have to know about part 23, what we can and cannot do on scaffolding. Toilet and washing facilities, this is under OH&S code part 24. If we are at a scene for facilities under 5 working days, it's actually up to us to ensure that we have some facilities for those people. Now a lot of times we can say, yes, if you really need the washroom, go back to the hall. That is arranging for facilities. If we are on a scene greater than 5 days, then we actually have to provide facilities at the scene. Drinking fluids must be provided, doesn't matter. It has to be there. That is one of those things, everything has to be followed. It can be just water, but it has to be provided. Tools, equipment, and machinery. This is all work sites, what the training requirements are for people operating tools or equipment or machinery, what the procedures are, and what the maintenance policies are as per those pieces of equipment. Ventilation systems. This deals with portable ventilation systems. It could be our positive pressure fans, it could be our smoke ejectors, or it could be a ventilation tube that's actually utilized during confined space entry and rescue. Violence and harassment. This is again followed in the code, OH&S part 27. All fire department activities, we have to have policies and procedures in place that deal with the reporting of incidences, investigating of them, and the documenting of them. It also is part and parcel now is psychological hazards. Psychological hazards are covered under the OH&S Act. They try to talk about measures to control all hazards. We do the best we can, but we could be faced with psychological hazards on any call. Some of the suggestions it has is eliminate or reduce exposure, so not everybody has to go to that vehicle. Not everybody has to see everything. Training, psychological training. Recuperation time and or exposure limits. So how long before you should go back and be at another bad scene? That's recuperation time. Exposure limits, how long are you being exposed to that site? And then post-exposure treatment, and this could consist of counseling, or it could also consist of critical incident stress management, debriefings, defusings. Working alone, OH&S code part 28. Working alone at a work site. This could also be talked about in the aspect of investigations and inspections. As I had said earlier in the presentation, some full-time departments are investigative branches. They will work alone doing an investigation. That is all under working alone policy. It has to be followed. Same with a person going out and doing fire inspections. They have to follow the working alone in part 28. Other incidents. So why I have this down as other incidents is our department will get toned out for a smoke investigation. Usually a single person in a delta goes by themselves. That would be a work alone. If we get called out for a citizen's assist on a needle pickup, a lot of times it's an individual delta unit that goes with one person. That's working alone. WMIS, part of daily operations. This is our safety data sheets. Everybody has to have WMIS training. Now with that, WMIS is supposed to be specific to the work site. So if in the realms of paid on call, if you have a person who works at Walmart and they've taken WMIS training there, they also have to take WMIS training at the fire hall. It's supposed to be two different courses. Demolition, they mention this where if you could be involved in building demolition is the course of suppression. So in the Slave Lake fires, they had to demolish some houses or areas. Same within the Fort McMurray fires. They had to demolish some houses. That would have to be followed. Excavating and tunneling, part 32. If you have a department that's involved in trench rescue, this will have to be followed. Explosives, OH&S code part 33. All of part 33 if we have it. Now it does mention about firefighting techniques. I believe whoever wrote this document is referring to back in the days when they used to do oil field well control fires, blowing it out by nitroglycerin. As far as I know, we don't do it anymore. Fireworks though could be a part. So if you have your local fire department that is involved in the setting off of fireworks or pyrotechnic devices for the community, this has to be followed. Okay. Storage, transportation, handling, qualifications, and procedures. Not all encompassing, so the parts and section covered in the guide, they're not all encompassing, but they're very close to the entire guide. Other areas that are not mentioned but may be important to some departments. So life jackets and personal flotation devices. This is in part 18 of the code, section 240 to 241. And what it talks about that if you're doing any kind of boat ops, what you have to have on you, what you have to have in the boat. If you have a department that is involved with diving operations, so it even could be recovery aspect, then there's a section on the code comes fully under. And then work requiring rope access, that is also under part 41 of the code. So the presentation questions that we actually talked about at the initial onset of the presentation, how did you do? So the first question we talked about is an emergency scene different than a fire investigation scene? Yes, there is a difference in the two. The actual fire scene is an emergent scene, where the fire investigation scene is a non-emergent scene. Years ago, it used to be mentioned on the old Code of Practice. The Code of Practice for Firefighters, that was a document released in March of 2007. They would say that you didn't have to follow everything in an emergency scene, but you had to follow everything in a non-emergency scene. Now, they are two different scenes, but we still follow the codes. Part 9, Section 138 of the OH&S Code. So this is the one that talked about the use of fall protection while climbing ladders and doing roof ops. I went through this and read it verbatim of the code. This is the only true exemption we do have in the OH&S Code. Question number 3, Part 18, Section 252 of the OH&S Code. This is the section that talks about clean shaving. Okay, that you must be clean shaven if you're using SCBA. So now, question 4 talks about the fire investigation scene. Yes, if you had an investigator working alone at an investigation scene, they would have to follow Part 28 of the OH&S Code, which is the working alone section. For the SCBA part of the question, that would also be dependent on your Code of Practice for respiratory protective equipment. I have not found anything in the code, and I have had the luxury of now reading this 3 different times, front to back. I have not found anything where it says if you're using SCBA, you have to have a buddy with you. We follow that in the fire service. You cannot pack up alone, but you would have to have written it into your Code of Practice on your respiratory protection. In conclusion, occupational health and safety is constantly changing and updating practices. Anytime something occurs, new policies come into place. And again, we are more of a retroactive society, meaning that once someone dies, then we put a new policy in place. Firefighting and rescue is not the same as it was 25 years ago. When I first started on the service, it was pretty simple. Here's your bunker gear, we're going to teach you how to put it on. Here's a pager. When it makes noise, show up to the hall. We'll give you the rest of your training as you go. Employers, you have to be accountable to their workers. There are not many areas of the legislation that we actually have exemption from. We have to follow the Blue Book. It's part of our daily activities. The thing is now is that we become used to it and we actually go through, read it, see what we do have to have. The interesting concept though, we already do most of this stuff. We just do it in a different way. The references for this presentation was the Occupational Health and Safety Act, Regulations and Code, Handbook with Amendments, and with that I have a link up here, a hyperlink. Everybody will get a copy of the presentation. And also the Occupational Health and Safety OH&S Guide for Firefighting March 2019. There's a hyperlink for that as well. I'd like to thank you for your time and hope you got something out of the presentation. Thank you.